I heard about that, and then Peter called the audible, and he's like, nope, you guys are staying in here. So.
Yeah, Brian found us out of it. He tried to tell Chase on Saturday, not knowing that I was covering Chase. I didn't find out until 10:05.
At the start of the service.
Sunday morning. The service had already started when I found out.
That's fun.
I was like, what?
Oh man, that's great.
So we kind of filmed this week since I already got me.
Cool. Sean, if you wouldn't mind hitting the light on the way downstairs. All right.
Because it's you here.
Thank you, Sean. I appreciate that. Can everybody see this okay? Okay. Because I'm trying this new stand here, and it's supposed to be for like the computer, but at the same time, yeah, I'm figuring it out. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to starting the first chapter. So we're going to go over a few things today on how to draft the first chapter of a story. It could also be the first part of a short story if you're wanting to do something a little bit more short form. But you're going to use a lot of the same tips and tricks for both writing long form chapters as well as short story. So here's our agenda for the day. I'll start with my introduction, which these two have heard it multiple times already. Then we'll talk about exposition versus in media res. Talking about setting the scene, introducing main characters. That's what the MC stands for. And then we'll talk about establishing the story, and then tips for writing, and then finally we'll have the writing prompt. Renee. So my name is Garrett K. Jones. I'm a local author and podcast host. My BA is in creative writing. And then I've got a series called The Archives of a Secret Rand, 5 books in that series right here. I also host 2 podcasts. One's called Storytellers, which is currently on hiatus at the moment. Just wrapped up a season on that back in April. And then I'm also a co-host on War of the Stars, which is a Star Wars podcast. And then I do a YouTube channel called The Right Way, where this is what this is going to be broadcast on, where we talk book recommendations, author interviews, writing tips, stuff like that. And then my favorite genre for reading, for the most part, is going to be science fiction, although I've been getting into a lot more thriller, suspense, and horror as of late. And I'm always a big fan of the classics. The last book I just finished was actually a really cool mashup. It was Sherlock Holmes and Count Dracula. And it was a really neat story set in this blend of Holmes's London post the events of Bram Stoker's Dracula. And there's references and characters from the Stoker novel that pop up in the story. It was a lot of fun. It was really cool. Renee, just to ask, what are you hoping to get out of this workshop today?
Just starting the first chapter.
Hey, honesty, quick to the point. I like that. All right, so with writing the first chapter, you start off, you have this amazing story idea. You've got characters developed. You're starting to put together your author brand. This is typically what a lot of authors do, especially when they're jumping on social media for the first time. You open up your writing tool, whether it's Scrivener or Dabble or WordPress, or in my case, I use Microsoft Word. I'm very old-fashioned like that. I like something that's very basic. And then you've got absolutely nothing. You've got nada. Zilch, goose egg. All right? Has that ever happened to any of you in here before? You're wanting to write something and then the idea just... It happens. So with writing chapter 1, the things that you want to focus on are how to start your chapter, establishing your fictional world, and introducing your characters and the story. That's always going to be the key thing that happens in the first chapter. It's always going to be the key thing that happens in the beginning of a short story, whether it's just a 500-word story like the one I wrote last night, or it's something a little bit longer than that. So we're going to start off with talking about exposition versus in media res, and I'll explain what both of these are. But the question you have to ask yourself when you're starting your chapter is, which of these are you going to use to open your chapter? Because each one of these has a different structure, a different dynamic. So we'll start with exposition. Exposition, this is where you explain a bunch of stuff. That's the best way to describe it. Exposition gets a bad reputation, especially amongst contemporary writers, but it's key for showing your audience how your characters live their lives. This is where, to borrow from the hero's journey, this is their ordinary world. This is where you explain their status quo as a character and their status quo in the environment. And the funny thing about exposition is that exposition can get really heavy really quickly. So many writing instructors, all the writing instructors that I had in college, they always said, show, don't tell. And the funny thing is that this is actually a rule for filmmaking. See, a lot of the times what happens in filmmaking is you have characters describing things that the camera should be showing. But the camera, if the camera's not allowed to do that, then all they're doing is they're just info dumping. One of the most egregious things I've seen is the newest Star Wars show, The Acolyte, where they're introducing the female protagonist, Osha, and another character tells her own history. And there's no reason for that character to do that because that's not how a real conversation would happen. That's something that would be explored through the camera. That would be something that would be explored or shared by that main character at some point later on in the series or in that episode. And instead, it's info dumped for the audience as if the audience can't figure it out for themselves. Now, in writing, we don't have a camera. So we have to explain, we have to provide detail. At some point, even if you don't open up your story with exposition, you're going to need exposition to explain the world, to explain the rules, to explain the world building. Hi, welcome. How you doing?
Oh, I'm doing good. Can't see you, but yeah.
That's okay. That's okay. So long as you can see the screen, you're good. So it's okay to tell your audience what's happening or when you're describing it. What you don't want to do though is you don't want to info dump. You do want to paint that distinct picture that's a distinct visual picture using sensory detail, but you don't want to info dump, where you put all that information on your reader or on your audience all at once. Is that a hand, James? Okay. So now if you open with in media res, you're choosing to skip the initial world building and the initial description because you want immediate action. All right? In media res translates from Latin to in the midst of things or in the middle of the action. All right? Now, my first book, The Heirs of Menenius, starts off like that. Okay? I mean, you kind of get a mix of world building, but in the very first chapter, in the prologue, it starts in media res. It says, footsteps echo dully under the cacophony of fiery catapult blasts against the outer walls of Helsing Fortress. So we know where we are. We're at a fortress. Someone's running down a hallway or running up a set of stairs, and there's catapult blasts and there's explosions. What one word describes that kind of a setting? Chaotic. What kind of an event are we talking about here? A war. So that first sentence in my book starts off the whole thing with giving the reader an understanding that we're in the midst of the action. There is a battle taking place. The perspective, and we'll talk more about perspective in a moment, but that perspective is coming from the title character who's only seen in that prologue and doesn't get seen again for the rest of the book because he dies. Spoiler alert. Now, what you're doing with in media res is you're deliberately avoiding wasting time with establishing a character's normal and their status quo because that will come later. The world building can happen little by little if you're doing in media res, but what you want to focus on is the attention getter. You want to grab your audience's attention, lock them in because they're going to be drawn to the action. Think about when something happens, like we have like a train wreck or a car accident, everybody stops in the middle of traffic and they turn their head to look at it. It's an attention getter. It's a terrible attention getter, but it grabs the audience. Think about movies that you enjoy, where instead of having that slow opening build, you have action taking place right in the middle of everything. One of my favorite examples is the movie Speed. You have a bunch of people getting into an elevator at the very beginning, and as the elevator starts up, all of a sudden, there's an explosion, and the elevator starts to drop, and then it stops because the brakes start to work. And that is the middle of the action. There's no rhyme or reason for why this is happening. We don't get any explanation for why someone put a bomb on an elevator in the middle of the downtown Los Angeles skyscraper. It's just happening. All right? It grabs the attention and it holds on. So if you're wanting to do something action-packed, you're going to want in media res, because exposition is great for the more slower-paced stories when you're wanting to be methodical and world build and stuff like that. In media res is going to be better for something that's faster paced. If you need me to go back to another slide, please let me know. I don't want to feel like I'm rushing anything. I want to make sure that you guys are getting the information. Sweet. All right, so I'm going to move on. So the next one we're going to be talking about is setting the scene. All right? Regardless of your chosen opening, whether you're doing exposition or you're doing in media res, your first chapter will set the tone for your story in its own way. Maybe you're setting the tone in a way that is positive, that is funny, or very energetic or effervescent. Maybe you're doing something dark and gritty and a little bit more serious and down to earth. Like I said, you want to avoid info dumping. You want to avoid putting all of that stuff up front. Okay? Think about how you operate with your narrative, especially if you're doing exposition. You want your descriptions to be like a camera. Think of it in terms of something cinematic. Okay? The camera starts in one direction and it moves and shows more and more and more little by little. When I think cinematically about that, I think about Back to the Future. At the opening of Back to the Future, all we get is the sound of ticking clocks against a black background, and as the scene fades in, we see those clocks. There's a bunch of them, all hanging on the walls, all sitting on shelves, and then the door opens, and we see a pair of sneakers and a skateboard. The skateboard and the backpack get dropped down. The sneakers come walking across the ground. Then we start seeing someone plugging a guitar into a really big, powerful amp, and then they jam on it. And the speaker just blows out and sends whoever it is flying across the room. And that's our first introduction to Marty McFly. And he doesn't say what his name is. He gets a call on the phone in the house that he's in, and it's Doc Brown, and he identifies as Doc Brown for us. Doc Brown says, "Hey, Marty, don't use the sound equipment because it's been having some issues." And then all of a sudden, the clocks all start going off at different intervals. The alarms are all going off, and it's now explained that all of those clocks were actually set back, or they're set ahead. I can't remember which direction. And Marty is now late for school. So as the camera is panning around, as you see these little things, nothing is dumped out front for you. There's no info dumping, very little dialogue until that phone rings and Marty picks up the phone and starts talking with Doc. And that's when we get our first indication of how these characters interact and the kind of crazy, wacky antics that they're going to get into for the next 90 minutes. All right? So you want to avoid that info dumping. One of the best ways to do that is think about how you want to place your descriptions. The stronger your word choices are, the better and the tighter that exposition or that description is going to be. All right? You want to think about how you want to follow your characters through a scene. Are you going to be following them, looking at things from their perspective in a first-person POV, or are you going to be following things from a third-person perspective, like almost like a bird's eye view or a God's eye view? What is more interesting? 2 pages of inner monologue, or brief, strongly worded, in-world interactions? What's going to grab your attention or your reader's attention the most? The second option, typically. But for someone like me, like I just got done reading that Sherlock Holmes Dracula story, okay? All of the Sherlock Holmes books are actually narrated by Dr. John Watson, who is Holmes's partner in solving crimes. Watson writes in almost like in a journal form, okay? And so everything is colored by his perspective. If there's a scene that happens where he has no idea what Holmes is up to, he talks about it later on. Everything is colored from his perspective. It's all first-person point of view, and he shares his story. Okay? It's how he views things, how he hears things, how he sees things, how he experiences things, and he, especially if you're familiar with anything from the Sherlock Holmes canon. Watson will actually make references to those other cases, or he will describe Holmes in a way where he might say, as you know, Holmes, behaved in his usual way, or something along those lines. All right? Some of those descriptions get regurgitated, but at the same time, while that's part of his inner monologue, he's the one narrating the story to us. So you kind of get grabbed in and pulled in by his perspective of things. All right. Are we good to move on, or are you still writing now? I think we'll move on. All right. So it doesn't take a lot of description in a first chapter to help readers understand the setting of the story. Think back to the sentence I read from my book. From the very beginning, we understand that it is a battleground, that it's a war. James picked up on that very quickly. All right? Keep it brief with a few foundational elements. You can build off of those foundational elements. One of the things I like to do, because I like to evoke sensory detail, is I like to explore what is being heard. I like to explore what is being seen, what is being felt, what is being smelled. If there's food involved, what is being tasted. You want to give it the briefest description with the strongest word choices, because what that's going to do is it's going to lock in the details with as little word space as possible. So this is how we go about setting the scene. So when you're introducing your main character, your MC, all right, and maybe you have more than one. First chapters are the ideal place to introduce your main character, all right? But the fun thing is you don't always have to introduce the protagonist. You can actually start with the antagonist. Or maybe you start with a tertiary character and let that tertiary character be the focus for just a couple of paragraphs, or maybe just one page, and see where it goes from there. Because, for example, going back to that prologue in my first book, Menenius, while he's the title character of the book, he's only in that one chapter. While his presence is felt throughout the rest of the book, while his legacy is felt throughout the rest of the book, he's only physically in that one chapter, and he's an antagonist from the very onset. Because as that chapter explores and as the rest of the book explores, you get to understand why a war came to his door, why people were launching catapult blasts at his fortress, why people were wanting to fight him. He was a tyrant. He did awful things. And so the chapter builds on that, but then you get to see how his legacy plays out, because the title is called The Heirs of Menonias. It deals with his descendants, and his descendants are awful people too. Now, when you're introducing your MC, you want to get your reader to connect with the characters by making their goals, their personality, their strengths, and their weaknesses relatable. All right? This is where we want to talk about writing good characters as opposed to Mary Sue characters. Does anyone know what the term Mary Sue means? It's okay if you don't. Huh?
The girl from Spider-Man?
No, that's Mary Jane. No. So a Mary Sue character is any character. It doesn't necessarily have to be typically the term is used for a female character, like a girl boss type character, where they experience zero challenge to anything that they do. A great example of this is Rey from the newer Star Wars films, so The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, and The Rise of Skywalker. In those movies, she has so many skills that she should not have from the very beginning. So for example, when we're introduced to her, she hunts for scraps on a desert planet. She knows a little bit of mechanic type stuff, but for the most part, she's a survivor. That's fine. That's a great start to a character. But then as the action starts to pick up, she's running by a bunch of spaceships that are just out there. They're being held on to. Someone owns them. And Finn, who's one of the other characters, is like, well, can we steal that one? She's like, oh, that's a piece of garbage. Let's go to that one. And so they run, and the ship that they're going to run to gets blown up, and they're like, the garbage will do. And it turns around, and it's the Millennium Falcon. This is a ship she's never flown on, but yet she knows how to pilot a starship without any practice or skill. She knows how to repair a starship without any practice or skill. She knows how to work the technology better than the guy who flew it for 30 plus years, when she's eventually introduced to Han Solo. Those are skills that she, as a 20-something young woman, should have no ability to do, and yet it comes naturally to her. All right? Then her experiences with the Force, becoming a possible Jedi. She's got no training, no experience with it. She should not be as strong as she is, and yet fighting with a lightsaber, using the Force to do some kind of mind trick on the stormtroopers, all that comes super easy, barely an inconvenience. That is a Mary Sue type character. She has no weaknesses. Nothing is challenging, nothing is hard for her. She's able to overcome any obstacle just because she's the main character. A lot of the times, if they survive something that should have killed them, we as writers refer to that as plot armor. Just because we want them to be survivable. And what that does is, while a lot of people do like Rey as a character, and if she was done a little bit more interestingly, I think I would lock in with her as a character. Her goals, her personality, her strengths, and her weaknesses are not relatable. In fact, she has no weaknesses. She has all strength, no weakness. Her personality is very, she comes off as kind of a know-it-all. She's very grating. And really her goals are not easily identifiable. Her main goal was to figure out who her parents were and getting off that desert planet and stop being a slave. She accomplishes that in the first act of The Force Awakens. Anything beyond that is stuff that doesn't really meet any of the goals that she wants to accomplish. Um,
I have a question.
yeah.
What's the name for a male Mary Sue? And what's the machine for?
You know what? That's a very great very good question.
And is there an example, are all the examples from movies or are there examples from literature? Script writing or novel writing?
Well, so from my take, I'm kind of a movie buff, so I tend to draw a lot of visual mediums, so movies, TV shows, stuff like that. I have never heard the term Mary Sue being used in a male-oriented version, and I'm sure there is one. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but I guess you could apply the term Mary Sue even to a male character. But I'm sure there are examples of characters where everything just comes naturally to them without any challenge. And again, those are characters that are incredibly boring, they're incredibly tedious, because they have nothing to learn. They've already figured everything out when they're at a point that they shouldn't. And so those kinds of characters, we talked about this a couple months ago when talking about developing characters. What happens is it creates a situation where characters are not dynamic and they're not well-rounded, or they're too well-rounded, too polished, and there's no reason for them to be there. So like, so for example, if you do a side-by-side comparison between Rey and Luke Skywalker, like Luke has some skill, but he's a novice when it comes to a lot of things. Like the first time he tries using the Force, he starts to give up and quit. He starts complaining. She does not. Like she's able to draw a lightsaber right to her for the first time she picks it up, and she's able to start doing all sorts of cool stuff with it.
There's a lot of male characters that are also just genius right away at what they do.
And some of those characters, you kind of get that sense, and some of those characters, again, they're flat characters, but it's how they might get presented that might make a difference. So for example, jumping back to Sherlock Holmes. Holmes is a kind of an arrogant character. Everything seems to come naturally to him. He's a very smart character, and he knows it. And so if you're reading through it, some of the way that he comes off can be pompous or arrogant or just really obnoxious, especially if you see it done in television or in film, because they play off of those eccentricities and they make him almost sociopathic. Holmes in the books was not a sociopath. He was just a very smart guy, but you could see that he would get annoyed when people couldn't keep up with the way how quickly his mind worked. Another character that kind of falls in line with that is Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory. We understand that he is genius level intellect. It's driven, it's drilled into our brains with pretty much every episode of the show. But think about if you've ever watched the show, how annoyed do you get with Sheldon throughout the episode? Like, for me personally, like I'll watch the show and I can laugh at the jokes, but like if I watch episode upon episode upon episode and like I'm binge watching, like he gets so obnoxious that I just kind of want to push him down a flight of stairs. Because things do come naturally for him. He's a really smart, really gifted person. He knows it. And the problem is he's been led to believe that he's special because of that. And so he's got no sense or understanding of humility. And that's what really annoys other people. And so, but the reason why Sheldon works so well and why he was on television for 12 years is because other characters operate as foils. Because he doesn't pick up on sarcasm, they're able to rip on him pretty easily. Or because they might be able to figure something out before he does, it drives him crazy. Especially if there's something that he should be excelling in and they have figured it out before he did. So having other characters work as foils against them is a really great tactic for getting rid of any Mary Sue tendencies that might pop up in a character's development. But like I said, you want to make these 4 points, their goals, personality, strengths, and weaknesses, relatable. So here's something to think about. Who is one of your favorite characters of all time, whether it's from a book, movie, TV show?
John Steinbeck.
Well, he's an author, not so much of a character.
Or if you want a character,
Yeah,
Jane Eyre.
Jane Eyre. Okay, Renee, what's Jane Eyre's goal in that book? I've never read it, so what's her goal, and is it relatable to you?
She's just a girl that goes through a lot of hardships, but she's just trying to make her own way in the world, be independent.
Okay, so she wants to be independent, she wants to be successful, and that's relatable. Most people want that freedom, especially here in America. We want that freedom. What kind of strengths and weaknesses does she possess?
Intelligence, compassion, inner strength.
Okay, well, what's one of her weaknesses? Like, does she lose her temper easily? Does she get frustrated really easily? Is she a little rash when it comes to decision making?
She's kind of naive,
Okay.
and she learns to set better boundaries with people.
Okay. So the naivety is something that can work against her, and again, that's relatable, especially if she's a young character. You know, teenagers, preteens, college age students can really easily relate to that. All right, James. Wyatt Earp. Okay, what was Wyatt Earp's goal? I mean, he's a historical figure, but he has been characterized in film and television. To protect and stay alive. Good goals. What's his personality like? That's a goal, not a personality. What's his personality like? Is he gruff? Is he friendly? Is he serious all the time? Does he make jokes? Okay. What are his strengths and weaknesses? Okay, he's smart. What else? Okay. So something to think about though, James. One of his weaknesses is that he was reluctant to do anything about the issues he was dealing with in Tombstone, Arizona. He didn't want to get involved with any work as a law enforcement agent. Exactly. But eventually he had to. Okay? And so that brought out his strengths as a lawman because he knew exactly what he was capable of doing. He had just been trying to avoid that. Any other examples that you guys can think of? Of a character's goals, personality, strengths, or weaknesses, and how you relate to it. Okay. Let's focus on the strengths and weaknesses.
His weakness is he feels like everyone is against him after the scare film and the king's father fought against him.
Okay.
Making him look like
Okay. So there was a little bit of a kind of a woe was me victim mentality going on, right? Okay, and so cool. So that's definitely a weakness that he has, and any one of us who might have encountered that little bit of adversity might do something similar, where we are hurting, we think that people are out to get us, or that things are just not fair, and so we kind of push back to give ourselves that space. James?
his weakness
Can only use a shield. Okay, so that works as both a strength and a weakness, because while he's strong enough to hold that shield and use it to protect himself, the weakness is that's the only tool that he has access to. What? Oh, okay. No, that's something I didn't know about the character. All right. So Again, you don't want to info dump about your character in that first chapter. Don't pack the chapter with everything about them. You want to piece it out. Maybe you give a little bit of their physical description. Maybe you talk about their height or their facial characteristics, hair color, eye color. Or as they're walking, you talk about the way that they walk. But you want to allow the rest of your story to expand your characters. You have an entire story to explore this character, whether it's their personality, whether it's a physical trait or characteristic. Maybe it's part of how they respond and how they express their emotions or they don't. One of the things I like to do with my characters is I like to piecemeal that, so you learn something new about them in every chapter that they show up in. Now, my books tend to have not a lot, but they have multiple characters, and so each time that character pops up in a chapter, whatever character that is, I want my reader to learn something new about them. So, for example, my character Gavin, between books 1 and 2, he is a very confident person. He's a ranger, so he travels around the land. He helps people. He kind of thwarts local crimes. He protects people, especially out in the wilderness. But because of his overconfidence, that which plays upon later in book 1, that results in some people close to him getting hurt. So by the time you start up book 2, he is really reluctant. His personality has shifted, and his attitude towards his calling in life has changed to the point where he doesn't want to pick up the sword. He doesn't want to go about doing it, and he's given an opportunity to see what the world is like if he continues on that path. So you want to play around with how you introduce information about your characters. No info dumping.
I think one cliche I struggle with as a reader
Mhm.
is how often that mirrors are used to describe the way the main character looks. And so I'm trying to stay away from that to describe my main character, but I'm also kind of stuck with how to do that.
So there's a couple of ways that you can do that. You can use other character interactions to describe the character. So like so I like to use multiple POVs in my books, where the chapter follows. I don't do it from a first person perspective. I do it from a third person. But for example, as I'm describing a character, so in book 1, for example, I have a character. Her name is Amara. Her oldest sister comes and she's like reading books in their library, and her older sister comes and says, "Hey, we've got the celebration. You need to come." And as her older sister is talking to her, it describes how that older sister looks and operates according to Amara's perspective. Amara has always looked at her as kind of like a surrogate mom because their mother passed away giving birth to Amara. And so there's this kind of a maternal quality to her older sister, even though her sister is not a mom herself. But later on in the book, another one of my characters, Asher, is staying in their home, and he sees the oldest sister, and he's completely captivated by her because he's definitely got a type for the kind of women that he's attracted to, and she looks very similar to someone he had loved earlier in the book, who was lost to him. So there's you can color, or you can describe a character from other characters' perspectives and get a more well-rounded description without having to use the cliche of mirrors or reflection. But the fun thing that you can do with that cliche is reflect back maybe that character's own insecurities. So instead of describing them physically, you can juxtapose that physical description with how they think about themselves. So if I'm looking in the mirror, I see my own face, maybe I start nitpicking the things I don't like about myself, like the fact that I can't grow hair on top of my head, so I have to shave it. Or maybe, my beard is starting to come in a little bit too gray, or maybe my one eyebrow is a little bit crazier than the other, and I have to, start, trimming that or something. Using those insecurities can help juxtapose how a character looks. Or maybe instead of the insecurities, it's you focus on the things that they like about themselves, the things that other people might overlook. Like maybe physically they're just average looking, but maybe that character likes the way that their eyes look, because while all their family members have hazel or brown eyes, this character has green eyes, or something along those lines. All right, let's see. Our next section is establishing your story. You want to consider the structure of your plot. All right. One of the things I like to do when I'm working out on a story is I want to structure how the plot is threaded together. I don't want to just dump everything all at once. I want to make sure that character arcs play a factor into what my plot points are and where I want my characters to go, physically as well as emotionally. So the question you have to ask yourself is: Are you writing or going linearly? Are you going in a straight line from beginning to end, so beginning, middle, and end, or are you going to go non-linearly by starting in the middle or at the end of the story and working backwards? Okay, and as I mentioned, I like to do a lot of references to visual mediums, especially movies. One of my favorite filmmakers is Christopher Nolan. And one of the things that Christopher Nolan does very well is he plays around with non-linear storytelling. He will jump around. In fact, one of his more recent films, Tenet, if you look at the title, the word Tenet is a palindrome, meaning it's spelled backwards and forwards the same way. And if you look at the structure of the film, it does the same thing. The film actually ends in the middle, and everything on the outset of it is a palindrome. So so you could literally watch the movie backwards or forwards, it will still make sense, because you will see the same things play out to the middle point. Another thing that he does very well with the nonlinear storytelling is he does really well with flashbacks. One of my favorite movies that he has ever done is The Prestige, which is based on a book by Christopher Priest. And it is about two stage magicians in Victorian London who are trying to outdo each other. It's actually not Victorian London, it's late 19th century, early 20th century. So electricity is starting to come into play. Edison is name dropped. So is Tesla. Both are name dropped in the book and in the movie. And the way that the book is written, everything is done in a diaretic style, which means that the two magicians are reading each other's journals, or someone is reading each other's journals. And the bulk of the story is colored by those different perspectives. In the film, you see that happening, where you see things are playing out from one perspective, being told in that journal style with voiceover narrative. And you're getting the whole thing from one side, and then you get it from the other side. And what's interesting is the actual bulk of the story happens kind of in the middle. You have to kind of find the middle ground to figure out what the clue is, what the trick is, because the film itself and the books are one giant magic trick from beginning to end. So playing around with nonlinear storytelling can be really fun, but if you don't do it right, it can get really confusing. Because if you're not used to it, it'll feel like the flashbacks don't make any sense to how it's connected to the flash forwards and vice versa. All right. And then, so how you start your story helps your reader understand it and get engaged in the plot. So we talked about the exposition in the in media res. You don't always have to start with exposition or in media res. You can always find like a kind of a middle ground between them. How you start your story is going to draw them in. In fact, I do something different with every single one of my chapters. Sometimes the chapters start off with the in media res. I like to start my books with the in media res, but my chapters sometimes will start with exposition as well, because I want to do some of that world building. It gives them an emotional investment that should pay off. You want your readers to be emotionally invested in what you've written, whether it's the landscape, the locations, the time setting, the characters, their personalities, their goals, all of that should be something that they're emotionally invested in, and that emotional investment pays off. All right, you're going to start by making the MC's goal clear to the reader. From the very beginning, you want to make sure that you have that goal put out there. In the book Aragon by Christopher Paolini, Aragon he wants to learn about his origin. He wants to learn about what happened to his family. He wants to get out of his small, tiny little village of Carvajal. He wants to get out of there. He wants to see the rest of the world. He's longing for adventure. He wants a break from the boring, humdrum life that he is living. He doesn't want to be a farmer. He doesn't like the life he's living. He thinks his uncle is kind of a putz. And while he really loves his cousin Roran, he wants to get out. He knows there's something different about him, and he wants out. So you can introduce or at least hint at the primary external conflict by introducing the antagonist or non-character opposition. Okay? That antagonist could be. Is that a hand, James? Very good question. So a non-character opposition is what kind of conflict or threat is that you can have that is not a character. So for example, is there a war going on? Is there some kind of disease pandemic? Maybe the existential threat is a computer AI that has gone rogue and is trying to wipe out humanity. All right? That would be a non-character opposition. All right? Think of another thing is if you want to do it more on a smaller scale, if your character struggles with finances, maybe the issue is the bank is coming to collect on their house or their car, and they can't afford to pay whatever they owe on that debt. All right? You want to be able to establish the conflict pretty quickly. So last night I was participating in a short story competition, and where they give you a genre, they give you an action that has to take place in the story, and they give you an object that has to be included. And for me, this pushed me out of my comfort zone because I was asked to write a rom-com. Not something I'm used to doing, but I wrote it. I had a really great idea, thanks in part to something my mom said last night. And I went with it, I rolled with it. It turned into a really funny scene. And the conflict is that the husband can't find the ice cream scoop. He's wanting to scoop some ice cream. His wife says, it's in the drawer. He's like, no, it's not. And she's like, then you didn't put it back right. He's like, what are you talking about? I put everything back where it's supposed to go. And so the conflict isn't so much the two spouses bickering back and forth with each other. The conflict is that things are missing and they're not found where they're supposed to be. And so he brings up the idea that maybe because she's 4 months pregnant, that she's suffering from pregnancy brain and that she's just getting forgetful about where she places things. She's like, I don't have that. And he's like, we found the TV remote control in your sock drawer. And she's like, that didn't happen. And she starts putting something else on him, saying, well, you left a coffee mug in the bathroom. He's like, yeah, I did that. That's my fault. And then the phone rings, and he goes to answer, and he's like, honey, and he points, and the ice cream scoop, the whole focus of their conflict is sitting in the charging cradle for the phone. And he's like, where's the phone? And she's like, I might have pregnancy brain. So the conflict arises not because of a person or because of the people, but because of the conversation that they're having, because things are missing and not placed where they're supposed to be. So that would be non-character opposition. All right? And the conflict also doesn't have to be something really serious or dangerous. It could be something as goofy and funny as that conversation. All right, so here's some questions that need to be answered when you are writing your first chapter. First of all, you need to ask, where and when are we? Some light world building. Who are the major players? Who is the main character? Who's your MC? What is the POV? That's point of view. And who is narrating? Is it one of the characters narrating, or is it going to be an omniscient narrator who knows the entire story? All right. And again, if you're doing the third person omniscient narrator, just because you know everything that's going to happen doesn't mean your characters are. Okay? You want that to unfold for the characters as much as you want for the readers to do that. And the last question is, what is the story's moral? What lesson, if there is any, what lesson is it trying to teach? So then we'll come back to these questions will be part of the writing prompt. So if you miss writing any of them down, that's okay. I'll come back to them in just a moment. But we've got 8 tips that we're going to go through. So tip number 1, you want to establish the tone and POV early on. Your first chapter should set the emotional tone and the perspective from which it is told. First person, third person, etc. You can do a second person perspective. Second person is where you say, the narrator says, you are in an alleyway. You see a monster at the end of the alleyway. Something along those lines. You're putting your audience as the main character and you're describing what they're seeing. If you any kind of role-playing game, like Dungeons and Dragons or something along those lines, that is second person perspective. All right? So that's tip number 1, establish tone and POV. Tip number 2, choose a natural starting point. The best openings start with a scene that feels right based on exposition or in media res decision, on that decision right there. So for my prologue, it took me forever to figure out the starting point. I kept writing a bunch of other stuff, and finally what I settled on was getting it started right in the middle of this action. Rather than describing all of the atrocities that Menenius accomplished in his reign, I want to start with the war. I want to jump right into that battle, right into that conflict, because the point was to see him fall and to see how the rest of the world picks up the pieces after he's defeated. Because all of those other atrocities, those are going to be explored throughout the rest of the book. Now the fun thing is even if you're writing through the story, even if you have that first chapter written, that first chapter may not necessarily work as the best starting point. And you might find that another part of the story would actually work better, and you can put that at the beginning. And that comes more into play when you're dealing with the revisions and the edits that would take place later on. So that's tip number 2. Tip number 3, don't set the stakes too high. The stakes should grow progressively more difficult over the course of the story. Okay, because if you start with your stakes all the way up here, you have nowhere to go. But if you start, say, down here at this kind of a level where the stakes are a little bit high for where the character's at that point, it's attainable for them to overcome that conflict, because then it gives them the skill set that they can use later on at the climax of the story when you've amped up the conflict and you've amped up the stakes to their highest level. Because then it challenges every single one of those things that your main character has learned. You want to scaffold up to that higher stake level of conflict. So don't set the stakes too high. Tip number 4. Use details expertly. This is the best way to quickly immerse a reader into your story. Just a little bit extra without info dumping will engross a reader. All right? So if you can give just a little bit, then you give a little bit of action, and then you give a little bit more world building or a little bit more character development, that is going to draw the reader in, because then they're wanting to know that next thing. They're wanting to see that. If whatever question that they have about the character's personality or about the world, it will get answered over the course of the story. Because if you give it everything all at once, then they're done. They don't need the rest of the information that you have. They don't need the rest of the adventure, whatever it is. Tip number 5. Give chapter 1 an exciting mini plot. Think of every chapter as an individual episode within the larger scope of your story, with a start, a middle, and an end. Okay? I have 2 major sections, maybe 3, in that opening prologue of book 1. The first section is that conflict in that battle at Menenius' fortress, resulting in his death. The second one is world leaders coming together, trying to figure out how to restore their world back to a sense of peace and normalcy. And it ends with 2 or 3 of those world leaders burying Menenius in the middle of nowhere and placing curses upon his burial place, so that if anyone finds it, they're stopped from being able to uncover and unlock him. All right? So there's 3 little mini plots, and that last one is just a few paragraphs at the very end. Okay? Having some kind of exciting mini plot will keep the reader engaged, and gives each chapter a nice little beginning, middle, and end. Tip 6, just do it. There's never going to be a perfect time to ever start writing your first chapter. You just have to kind of make the time and take action. This is something that a lot of writers will struggle with. I cannot tell you the number of writers that I've connected with on social media who have said, "Hey, I don't know, I don't have a perfect ideal time to sit down and write. I'm too busy with work, I'm too busy with kids, I'm too busy with relationships or other activities that I've got going on. I just don't have the time." And the thing is as a writer, you have to make time. Now, for me, my schedule, I will make the same claim that by the time I get home from work, I am wiped out. I don't want to do anything when I've got my son with me. My son takes a lot of focus and a lot of energy, but at the same time, I will find time to write. And I do a lot of writing when I am on my free time or I've got other things going on. Last night I was part of that writing competition because I scheduled that in advance because I was looking forward to it. And so last night, when I sat down at my computer and I got my assignment for that competition, boom, I was taken off, I was writing. An hour later, I had my 500-word short story done. I had gone through, I had edited, I had made sure I had the word count. I called up a friend of mine, I read it to her. I said, "Hey, how's this sound?" She thought it was great, she thought it was funny, it was cute, it was really sweet. something different for my style of writing. And she helped me come up with the brief one-sentence synopsis for it, and I uploaded it. I read it to my mom this morning. She thought it was hilarious. She cracked up in the car. She got the biggest kick out of it. You need to make sure to give yourself that time to write. Even if it requires you to take, if you're a person who's addicted to technology like I am, taking your cell phone, putting it somewhere else, turning it off, putting it on Do Not Disturb, and locking it away for an hour. In fact, there are lock boxes that you can get on Amazon that it's a time lock. You can't force it open. You put your phone in there, and the whole thing works as a giant Faraday cage. It prevents signals from coming in. It prevents signals from going out. It will time lock for an hour or 2 hours, however long you need, so that you can give yourself that time to write. Because being on social media, being on technology, having access to YouTube or streaming services can be a huge distraction. So you got to make that time, and you got to take action. Tip number 7: build momentum. If you're struggling to write the opening of your story, start by writing a scene or a sequence from a later part in the story. That's one of the things that I do. If I'm struggling with where I'm at, I jump ahead to another part. I write something else. Maybe it's a line of dialogue that's been rattling through my head for weeks or days or whatever. I'll write that out. I use the note app on my phone a lot for doing stuff like that. I will write out whole descriptions or whole paragraphs of how things are going to play out. I take notes for how I'm going to describe certain things. I start working around that obstacle of not being able to get through the opening of my story. And lastly, tip number 8. Read other opening chapters. One of the things I tell my writing classes is that reading is inhalation, it's breathing in. Writing is exhalation and breathing out. The more you read, the more ideas you will get. I am a voracious reader. Now, most of what I read now is on audiobook because I listen to audiobooks while I'm working. I'm on my feet 8 hours a day. I'm a facilities director, and so having the opportunity to just sit down with an audiobook while I'm working, whether I'm building something or cleaning something, whatever it is, it gives me that opportunity to A, get in some reading time without having to really pick up a book, and B, it helps inspire and encourage my own creativity. Because reading factual it also is good to read fiction, because when you read fiction, it actually stimulates your brain to think creatively. Because then you start thinking about how you would introduce a character, how you would describe a setting, how you would start a story. All right? And when you start getting those juices going, I recommend that if you get a chance to sit down and write out some notes for yourself about how you're going to do that, do it. One of the things that I also want to encourage, and it wasn't in this list, I'm a plotter for the most part. When I'm working on these books, I will plan out, I will do a chapter by chapter synopsis of everything that's going to happen in each chapter throughout the scope of the story. And the reason why I do that is because I need to know where I'm going with the characters, because I've got a lot of characters to follow. I've got a lot of things that I need to make sure are threaded together properly. And I will constantly look at that roadmap to make sure I'm doing it. Now, with a short story like the competition last night, I was completely writing off the seat of my pants. But I had an idea with where I wanted to go and the sense of humor with which I wanted to play with. The whole thing about the ice cream scoop being missing and then later finding it on the phone cradle actually is inspired by something that happened when my son was an infant, and he hid his uncle's TV remote control in the freezer for a year. No joke, really happened. they searched for it for a year and they didn't even bother to look in the freezer. And it wasn't hidden, it wasn't buried, it was just right there on a shelf next to the ice cream. So, that is pretty much it. So we're going to come up on the, we've got about 23 minutes. Here's your writing prompt. These are those 4 questions that I had just a little bit ago. What I want you to do is I want you to write a single paragraph answering the following questions. Okay? Now this doesn't have to be narrative paragraph. It can just simply be a description written in paragraph form to answer all these questions. But go through, you've got 23 minutes, answer all 4 of these questions in a single paragraph. And that's your writing prompt. So where and when are we? Who are the major players and who's the MC? What is the POV and who's narrating? And what is the story's moral? I'll leave this up on the screen, and at this point I will stop the recording.